into these three markets and hear about some individual stocks in Australia, Brazil, and Canada that could make you a lot of money. We'll learn where Sean Brodrick and Rudy Martin are finding value, and it's not just in the energy and materials sectors. Plus, a final comment from Martin Weiss when Money in Markets returns.
Hi there, this is Mike Larson, editor of Weiss Research's Safe Money Report. You can't just focus on stocks anymore if you want to be a successful investor, and you can't just focus on the United States either. You need to know what's going on in Asia, which Tony covers. You need to know what's going on in hard assets like oil and gold, which Sean and Larry are on top of. You need to know what's happening in currencies, the specialty of Bryan Rich. You also need to keep abreast of the best ways to build wealth in an era of near 0% interest rates, and that's what my colleague Nilis Mativ covers. And of course, you need the top-down, big-picture analysis that Safe Money delivers to you each and every month. Best of all, the Weiss Elite membership gives you access to all of that and more. The Weiss Elite gives you the tools and knowledge to profit from all of these market developments. Now, I may be biased, but I think it's a no-brainer, and I'm glad you're one of the smart investors who recognizes that fact. Thanks for your time.
Welcome back, everyone, to Money in Markets. Throughout this show, we've told you why the economies of Canada, Australia, and Brazil are all poised for success and how to play those markets using exchange-traded funds. Now, time to get even more specific. Joining me on set are Sean Brodrick. Hello, Sean.
Thanks.
Sean is a small caps and natural resource analyst at Weiss Research. Also, Rudy Martin is here. Hello, Rudy. Rudy, of course, is the publisher of the Latin Stock Investing newsletter. Now, first, I want to ask you both about whether you're finding the same opportunities in these markets as some of our previous guests. Rudy, I want to start with you. What are the similarities that we're seeing in all three of these countries?
Well, the similarities are that these are obviously countries that have developed and as a result of natural resources. They're exporting primarily to China. And in the case of Brazil, though, there's a unique story there. A large segment of the population was on the verge of poverty there, and as a result of the economy booming, now these people have opened bank accounts, they've got credit cards, they're paying their taxes, and that alone has the potential to double the size of Brazil's economy again. So I don't think that's well understood yet. Okay, Sean, your thoughts, overall view of both of all three of these countries?
Well, I agree with him, but it's actually more than what we normally think of as like natural resources. Of course, the mining and with all sorts of metals and energy, it's a big part of all three countries, but also agriculture. I mean, Brazil, Canada, and Australia, they're all major agriculture exporters and becoming more so. They're feeding a hungry world, and that's one of the things that's boosting them along.
Sean, give me some specific names coming out of Canada for the ag market.
Well, for example, you could play through Potash Corporation. That produces a mineral that all farmers need, and Canada has a lot of potash, and they're feeding into the U.S. market and all over the world. And so that's one way you can actually play that. There's a lot more going on, of course. I mean, energy, I think, is a great thing we need to look at as well.
Okay, Rudy?
Well, I mean, piggybacking off of Sean's comments, when you're talking about potash, Canada has 53% of the world's reserve of potash, so they're going to be a factor in the agricultural market going into the future. And to the extent that places like Brazil and Argentina and even the United States are going to need fertilizer, the ag sector is going to be an important one in the next 5-10 years. In addition to the kind of companies that we're talking about in the international markets, there are U.S. companies as well that will also benefit from that. Companies like AGCO that produces tractors, Monsanto that produces seeds, and you've got other companies in the general machinery area such as the Cats and the Deers as well.
Okay, let's go to energy now in Brazil. What are some big players there?
Well, obviously when you talk about energy, you're talking about Petrobras,
right.
Ticker symbol PBR. This $170 billion market value company is the dominant oil company in the hemisphere, Latin America, and in addition to all the oil funds that they have, they are also increasingly producing more ethanol. So about a few years ago, it was just a few years ago, to give you a little bit of a backdrop, that Brazil's was importing energy, and now they're at a point where all the renewable energy that they have, they're self-sufficient. And in just a few more years, they're going to be a major exporting power as it relates to energy.
Yeah, well, I would just like to build on that, which is that Brazil has an amazing 1-2 potential in energy, along with all the deep water oil that they're finding through Petrobras. And there are companies from around the world that are coming to Brazil to work with them because they have such potential down there. They're inventing new technologies, and that really makes that one of the shining jewels of Brazil. You also have ethanol, like you mentioned. You have companies like Cosan, which is a great ethanol play. And so now, along with oil, Brazil will also be exporting sugarcane ethanol to the rest of the world. So they have tremendous potential there. That's one of the things that has helped lift 22 million people out of poverty and into the middle class in Brazil over the past 5 years. That's why we're seeing their unemployment rate go down, and those are two things you're not seeing here in the US. That shows why Brazil has such incredible potential. That shows why Brazil is really in a special place because of what it's doing at home, what it's doing here in the Western Hemisphere. And also, I've been to the Panama Canal. I've seen ship after ship after ship come through from Brazil, headed to China. They also export to places like China as well. So they're really set up for some really tremendous growth and great opportunity going forward.
Rudy, you agree?
I'm pretty much in line with that. In addition to the two companies that we've talked about, there's a company called Vale, which is the iron ore producer. That's a big Brazilian play. And I think that has some real good potential going forward.
Well, actually, also, just to bring this back, there are many Canadian companies working down in Brazil because Brazil is such a treasure trove. And Canadian companies, especially the mining companies, tend to export their expertise around the world. They're some of the smartest miners in the world, and there's these great projects, you know, these resources that are off the beaten track in Brazil, in Thailand, in China, that just haven't been discovered yet. And these smart little Canadians are down there finding them. So you have a company like, for example, Eldorado Gold, symbol EGO here in the US. That has a project in Brazil, but also has one in China and a big one in Turkey, and it's expanding around the world. It should produce around 600,000 ounces of gold this year, and it keeps expanding and it keeps building up. And so you have examples like that where they may be a Canadian company, but they're working around the world, especially in these markets we're talking about.
Rudy, let's talk some of the other sectors in Brazil.
Well, the sector that I'm most excited about is in Brazil now is also telecom. But the way to play that isn't with the local Brazilian companies, but with the companies that have acquired other players in the market. And my first pick there would be a company called América Móvil, ticker symbol AMX. That's owned by Carlos Slim. And
the wealthiest man in the world.
Yeah, and the reason he got so wealthy was going in and finding companies with a dominant position that are well capitalized and high growth potential. And that's not just the case in the wireless industry in Mexico, where he started from, but the 18 other countries that he's working in, and in Brazil, which is the highest growth market as it relates there. The other telecom pick that I have for that market is a company called Telefónica, ticker symbol TEF, and that's a Spanish company that just acquired the Brazilian leading player there. So between América Móvil and Telefónica, these are the two dominant Latin American, South American telecommunications companies, and they both offer great yields.
Sean, I want to spend our remaining time here on Australia now. Australia has seen amazing growth and has done remarkably well throughout this global economic meltdown, mainly because of China, correct? But what is the success story coming out of Australia? Give me some specific names in some of the sectors there.
Sure. Well, let's just talk about their economy for a bit. It's really going well. In fact, it's so hot that Australia has had to raise its prime loan rate 6 times. You haven't seen that in the U.S. That just shows you that they've actually tried to cool off the Australian economy. It's not just because of China, though China's a big source of it. It's all the emerging markets, especially around the Pacific Rim. Australia feeds to all of them. And in fact, there are mining jobs going begging down in Australia simply because they can't fill them. That's how things are going there. But there are 2 big names down there. One is BHP, you know, world's biggest miner. Everybody knows that one. And they produce everything from uranium to iron to copper to you name it. The other is Rio Tinto, another diversified miner down in Australia, another big iron producer. And those are 2 examples. Those are the ones most people would know about. But there are other ones you don't know about. Like the Canadians, the Australians export their expertise around the world. So in Thailand, for example, there's an Australian miner called Kingsgate. It's in one of my portfolios. And they have a beautiful gold resource there that was just overlooked the first time people were out there. And so they keep expanding it and expanding it and expanding it. That's an example of how these miners in these countries that we're talking about can export their just knowledge and really work around the world. And we've talked basically about the metals you pull out of the ground. There's also a great Australian company called Sims that's in recycled metals. If you believe that the global economic recovery is going to continue, if you believe the China story is still going to go on for a while, the price of recycled metals is just going to go up and up and up. There's a company called Sims down in Australia. It should probably do well too.
Okay, Rudy, thoughts on Australia?
I pretty much agree with Sean in regards to his two big picks there, the Rio Tinto and the BHP, especially since they're competitors with Vale. And those are the only comments I have on Australia.
And I guess in closing here, what we see, the greatest success stories for these three countries are obviously their fingers are expanding in global pies. Yeah?
Absolutely. That and the fact that they have great resources that weren't found in the first resource boom of the 20th century. These things were overlooked. And so therefore, even where they are, I mean, they can find incredible resources that you can mine cheaply. And that's something you can't do here in the U.S. We have found all the big resources here. But in some place like, say, China, where many of these companies work, you can find some king-size resources and do very well.
All right, Sean, Brodrick, Rudy Martin, thanks so much for joining us here on Money and Markets. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for topics that you'd like us to cover, just email us here at Weiss Money Network at weissinc.com. I'm Jamie Holmes, and now, Martin Weiss.
You've heard today about the economies, the companies, and the investments associated with some of the world's most promising foreign markets. Now, let me tell you a personal story based on my life experiences. Almost 6 decades ago, when I was 6 years old, my parents announced with great fanfare and excitement that the entire family was moving from Stamford, Connecticut to Anápolis in the Central Plateau of Brazil in order to establish a second home there. A short time later, 2 Hollywood movie stars, Janet Gaynor and Mary Martin, would also move down with their families to the same exact area for the same reason. And 4 years later, Brazil's president, Juscelino Kubitschek, would break ground for the construction of Brazil's new modern capital, Brasilia, also in the same region. But when my family and I boarded the first boat for Brazil, my mother's relatives thought we were nuts. Even Florida was too far for them. Central Brazil, heck, the Hudson Bay in Canada or the outback in Australia would have sounded more familiar and less wild to them. My dad responded calmly. He said, "Brazil is the future." And ultimately he was right, except for one nagging problem. It seemed the future never came. To finance the construction of the new capital, Brasilia, President Kubitschek ran the printing presses, and he borrowed heavily from overseas. The Brazilian currency collapsed, and everything else seemed to go down the tubes with it. Infrastructure, honesty in government, even schools. Several years later, and more recently, Brazil's current president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula for short, came along. And he has helped change all that. When he was first elected, everyone said he was going to drive Brazil into the gutter. But we knew Lula personally for many years, and we knew they were wrong. Sure enough, he imposed austerity. Before we can spend taxpayers' money, he said, we have to save taxpayers' money. And before we can save, he said, we have to tighten our belts and pay off our debts. So in his first month in office, Lula called in all the country's ambassadors from overseas. He gathered them in a room and gave them a stern lecture. You think you're strictly diplomats, don't you? Well, I have news for you, he announced. From this day forward, you're also going to be salesmen. You're going to sell Brazil and Brazil's exports, not just coffee, but also automobiles, not just soybeans, but also aircraft. Exports surged, and Brazil's trade surplus exploded, and Brazil paid off every penny of its foreign debts. That's the kind of approach that laid the groundwork for the explosive growth Brazil and other countries are enjoying today. It's also the path that highly indebted nations like the UK are now embarking on. But Washington still doesn't get it. Until they do, and until the U.S. can again find its footing, the risk-reward in most U.S. investments is bound to be negative, while the risk-reward in countries like Brazil, Canada, and Australia is bound to be far more positive. Their future is not risk-free, but it has finally arrived. Thank you. This is Martin Weiss for Money and Markets. I'll see you again here next week.